Hello, and welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer. Last time I read you a story about the Muppets. I have more stories about them, but we'll get to those another time. But for now, if any of you are familiar with Arnold Lobel stories like Frog and Toad and Mouse Soup, well, you're in luck. Because today I have the 4 books of Frog and Toad written by Arnold Lobel. And today we're going to read the first of the 4 books, and this is a 50th anniversary edition too. Frog and Toad Are Friends by Arnold Lobel. Now, I'm not criticizing him or anything, but in real life, toads are actually bigger than frogs. And it shows Frog bigger than Toad in this book. I'm just saying, it doesn't matter, because I love Arnold Lobel's illustrations. Each book has 5 small stories in them. So, now let's read the first one from 1970. Frog and Toad Are Friends. You ready? Alright, let's begin. Story number 1. Spring. Frog ran up the path to Toad's house. He knocked on the front door. There was no answer. "Toad! Toad!" shouted Frog. "Wake up! It's spring!" "Bah!" said a voice from inside the house. "Toad! Toad!" cried Frog. "The sun is shining, the snow is melting. Wake up!" "I'm not here," said the voice. Yeah, right. Frog walked into the house. It was dark. All the shutters were closed. "Toad, where are you?" called Frog. "Go away," said the voice from a corner of the room. Toad was lying in bed. Go figure. He had pulled all the covers over his head. Frog pushed Toad out of bed. He pushed him out of the house and onto the front porch. Toad blinked in the bright sun. "Help!" said Toad. "I can't see anything." "Don't be silly," said Frog. "What you see is the clear, warm light of April, and it means that we can begin a whole new year together, Toad." "Think of it," said Frog. "We will skip through the meadows and run through the woods and swim in the river. In the evenings, we will sit right here on this front porch and count the stars." "You can count them, Frog," said Toad. "I will be too tired. I'm going back to bed." Toad went back into the house. He got into the bed and pulled the covers over his head again. "But Toad!" cried Frog. "You'll miss all the fun." "Listen, Frog," said Toad. "How long have I been asleep?" "You've been asleep since November," said Frog. "Well then," said Toad, "a little more sleep will not hurt me. Come back again and wake me up at about 1/2 May. Good night, Frog." "But Toad," said Frog, "I'll be lonely until then." Toad did not answer. He had fallen asleep. Frog looked at Toad's calendar. The November page was still on top. Frog tore off the November page. He tore off the December page, and the January page, and the February page, and the March page. He came to the April page. Frog tore off the April page too. A little anxious, aren't we? Then Frog ran back to Toad's bed. "Toad! Toad! Wake up! It is May now." "What?" said Toad. "Can it be May so soon?" "Yes," said Frog. "Look at your calendar." Toad looked at the calendar. The May page was on top. "Why, it is May!" said Toad as he climbed out of bed. Then he and Frog ran outside to see how the world was looking in the spring. I mean, he just said it was April, but he just wanted to spend the time with his friend. And who can blame him? 2 heads are better than 1. Story number 2. The Story. One day in the summer, Frog was not feeling well. Toad said, "Frog, you're looking quite green." "But I always look green," said Frog. "I'm a frog." "Today you're looking very green even for a frog," said Toad. "Get into my bed and rest." Toad made Frog a cup of hot tea. That always helps. Frog drank the tea and then he said, "Tell me a story while I'm resting." "All right," said Toad. "Let me think of a story to tell you." Toad thought and thought, but he could not think of a story to tell Frog. "I'll go out on the front porch and walk up and down," said Toad. "Perhaps that'll help me think of a story." Toad walked up and down on the porch for a long time, but he couldn't think of a story to tell Frog. Then Toad went into the house and stood on his head. "Why are you standing on your head?" asked Frog. "I hope that if I stand on my head, it'll help me to think of a story," said Toad. "That's not good, Toad. All the blood will go to your brain." Toad stood on his head for a long time, but he couldn't think of a story to tell Frog. Then he poured a glass of water over his head. "Why are you pouring water over your head?" asked Frog. "I hope that if I pour water over my head, it'll help me to think of a story," said Toad. Toad poured many glasses of water over his head, but he couldn't think of a story to tell Frog. Then again, they are amphibians, so... Sorry. Then Toad began to bang his head against the wall. Well, that's not going to help at all. "Why are you banging your head against the wall?" asked Frog. "I hope that if I bang my head against the wall hard enough, it'll help me to think of a story," said Toad. "I'm feeling much better now, Toad," said Frog. "I don't think I need a story anymore." "Then you get out of bed and let me get into it," said Toad, "because now I feel terrible." Frog said, "Would you like me to tell you a story, Toad?" "Yes," said Toad, "if you know one." "Once upon a time," said Frog, "there were two good friends, a frog and a toad. The frog wasn't feeling well. He asked his friend the toad to tell him a story. The toad couldn't think of a story. He walked up and down on the porch, but he couldn't think of a story. He stood on his head, but he couldn't think of a story. He poured water over his head, but he couldn't think of a story. He banged his head against the wall, but he still couldn't think of a story. Then the toad didn't feel so well, and the frog was feeling better. So the toad went to bed, and the frog got up and told him a story. The end." "How was that, Toad?" said Frog. But Toad did not answer. He had fallen asleep. I guess banging his head against the wall knocked him out. It can happen. Story number 3. A Lost Button. Frog and Toad went up for a long walk. I like long walks too, especially in the country. They walked across a large meadow. They walked into the woods. They walked along the river. At last they went back home to Toad's house. "Oh, drat," said Toad. "Not only do my feet hurt, but I have lost one of the buttons on my jacket." "Don't worry," said Frog. "We'll go back to all the places where we walked. We'll soon find your button." They walked back to the large meadow. They began to look for the button in the tall grass. "Here's your button," cried Frog. "That's not my button," said Toad. "That button is black. My button was white." Toad put the black button in his pocket. A sparrow flew down. "Excuse me," said the sparrow. "Did you lose a button? I found one." "That's not my button," said Toad. "That button has 2 holes. My button had 4 holes." Toad put the button with 2 holes in his pocket. They went back to the woods and looked on the dark paths. "Here's your button," said Frog. "That's not my button," cried Toad. "That button's small. My button was big." Toad put the small button in his pocket. A raccoon came out from behind a tree. I heard you were looking for a button, he said. Here's one I just found. That's not my button, wailed Toad. That button is square. My button was round. Toad put the square button in his pocket. Frog and Toad went back to the river. They looked for the button in the mud. Here's your button, said Frog. That is not my button, shouted Toad. That button is thin. My button was thick. Toad put the thin button in his pocket. He was very angry. He jumped up and down and screamed, The whole world is covered with buttons, and not one of them is mine. Toad ran home and slammed the door. There on the floor he saw his white, four-holed, big, round, thick button. Oh, said Toad, it was here all the time. What a lot of trouble I have made for Frog. And the sparrow and the raccoon. But mostly Frog. Toad took all the buttons out of his pocket. He took his sewing box down from the shelf. Toad sewed the buttons all over his jacket. Very unique design. The next day, Toad gave his jacket to Frog. I assume it's a peace offering or something. Frog thought that it was beautiful. He put it on and jumped for joy. None of the buttons fell off. Toad had sewed them on very well. Nice. Story number 4. A swim. Frog and Toad went down to the river. What a day for a swim, said Frog. Yes, said Toad. I'll go behind these rocks and put on my bathing suit. I don't wear a bathing suit, said Frog. Well, I do, said Toad. After I put on my bathing suit, you must not look at me until I get into the water. But they're amphibians. They don't really need to wear clothing at all, but... Oh, no matter. Why not? Asked Frog. Because I look funny in my bathing suit. That's why, said Toad. Frog closed his eyes when Toad came out from behind the rocks. Toad was wearing his bathing suit. Don't peek, he said. Frog and Toad jumped into the water. They swam all afternoon. Frog swam fast and made big splashes.